Hi everyone, my name is Jiin, and I'm here to present my research to share with you. And I have to acknowledge first that my research has been greatly influenced by this webinar series, and so I'm very much deeply thankful to Max for organizing this webinar series from the beginning, and also for this valuable opportunity. So I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional ancestor and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Chilliwatus nations. Okay, let's talk about the puzzle first. Parents migrated partly to escape South Korea's hyper-competitive education culture. In Canada, they reproduce it. Why? The easy answer is culture. This is what South Korean parents do, driven by what scholars have called education fever. Today, I want to argue that this answer misses what is actually happening, and that paying closer attention reveals a structural story, not a cultural one. Let me name the homeschool binary blind spot, which is what the research field has not seen so far. First of all, engagement is theorized in or near school. Even critical and asset-based frameworks largely theorize immigrant parent engagement in relation to the school, within it, resisting it, or compensating for its failures. Shadow education is under-theorized. Private tutoring and fee-based supplementary education, for example, hagwons, the South Korean cram schools, remain under-theorized as sites of diaspora parent engagement, even though that is playing a huge role. Also, prior knowledge, parents' prior educational experiences are treated as cultural context rather than as historically and materially produced formations, to my understanding, that actively shape current parent engagement and their navigational strategies. Let me introduce briefly the theoretical framework. I draw on two traditions of theories, which both are rooted in social-cultural theories of learning. On one hand, I draw on legitimate peripheral participation, LPP, and community practice, conceptualized by Leif and Wenger. The combination of theories allow this research to conceptualize parent engagement as socially constructed learning, and newcomers move from periphery toward fuller membership, and this series allow me to trace those how they are moving. And then it also allows me to see how they learn through joint enterprise within communities of practice. While LPP and COP are highlighting this participatory optimism, the second theory, the history in person, it offers a structural critique. This is by Holland and Leib, and it allows me to see how past historical and material experiences, including institutionalized struggle, professional de-skilling, and marketized education, actively shape current parent engagement practice. So by holding both participatory optimism and structural critique, the theory this framework allows me to trace movement and the structural forces that constrain or sustain it. Let me introduce methodology. Critical ethnography and targeted interviews are the main method that I employed. I conducted ethnography fieldwork for 6 months with a Swiss-supported parent group. So Swiss stands for Settlement Workers in Schools. This is Canadian nationwide, federally funded by IRCC, the policy initiatives, and language specific, which serve as bridges between newcomer families and Canadian schools, sometimes embedded in school districts, sometimes provided by settlement organizations. So I got involved with this parent support group in one school district, and the Swiss worker, the person was running this program monthly, and art through art-based gatherings. So each time there were 5 to 20 parents, and I interacted with them, observed them, and then 7 parents among them consented to be observed. 5 also interviewed. So they were having at least one child at secondary school in British Columbia, Canada. I have to acknowledge that I had the insider personality, which is I was South Korean. I am South Korean immigrant parent myself of two children who were attending in BC public system. And so I have been involved with this parent group since 2019, so which facilitated the rapport and the trust-based relationship. At the same time, I had to be reflexive of my own biases and preconceptions throughout the fieldwork. I also conducted targeted interviews to reach the parents who cannot attend daytime Swiss gatherings like this. So I recruited these 10 parents via Korean language social media, and they were those parents who have arrived in Canada within 5 years, having children at secondary school. In total, there were 70 parents, 16 mothers, and 1 father, which reflects the gendered parenting practices among South Korean immigrants and also perhaps broadly among parents. So let me introduce 3 spheres of parent engagement, the analytical framework that I have developed in my study. Drawing on the gaps and literature review that I have previously presented to you, and also sociocultural theories of learning that allowed me look out of the school gate, other places that parents were engaging in the children's education. I was able to identify 3 different spheres where parents' engagement occurs. Number 1, official sphere, meaning schools, school boards, and teachers drawing on official knowledge in the institutional space. The shadow sphere is mostly private and supplemental education. For Korean parents, especially, this is populated by hagwons, the Korean-style cram schools, if you know about this. So communal sphere is the last one. This is mostly ethnic-based networks where parents gain co-ethnic peer learning and mutual repertoire. What I want to argue with this 3-sphere model is that these 3 spheres are not parallel. They are interconnected. And then the dynamic across 3 spheres, I call the loop of anxiety. This loop of anxiety is at the center of this dynamic, which will be unpacked further. And I argue that this loop of anxiety is structure, not culture. Okay, let me introduce some of the findings. The first, where the loop begins in the official sphere, which I call at the center of the finding is institutional opacity. So let's hear some parents' voices. Aileen said about course selection, since I had no information, the vocabulary itself was so unfamiliar. I knew what the word elective means, but I had no idea what I was supposed to do with them. There was just nothing to guide me. Unmu says, English level was too high for me, no numerical scores and things like extending and proficient and developing. I had to translate every word. And Jenny, about PAC, the Parents Advisory Committee, she says, I had the desire to participate, but they were discussing this year's budget. There was no welcoming message. It felt like a word of their own. So the findings show that parents were facing confusing artifacts, including school newsletters, report cards with such terms like extending, developing, proficient instead of grades, and course selection forms were in unfamiliar vocabulary. And also there was no clear contact point. While South Korean education system has this homeroom teacher for K-12 education, so it was serving as a clear contact point In Canadian education system, there was no such thing. So it was split by counselors and subject teachers. So all, course selection has to go through counselors, while the subject matter, subject issues have to go through subject teachers. And this split was disorienting for many parents in my study. And also PAC, the Parents Advisory Committee, it functions as a close administrative committee focusing on budget administration and also fundraising, which was not familiar to Korean immigrant parents. And the conference, teacher parent conference, which is the only communication channel that these parents perceived, but it was too brief, under 10 minutes per subject sometimes. In my school, my son's school is only 8 minutes, and mostly without translation service. And and also the coping strategies were varied. There was no uniform, coping strategy among parents. And then this typology, which is I'm developing in my study and which is forthcoming, reserved for dissertation chapters. So what I found from these parents is that school assumes a level of systemic literacy, which they do not actually provide. So the problem, the deficit is not on parents, but the problem was that there is a systems logic, but which is not accessible to many parents in my study. So parents faced with this, they do what makes structural sense. They look for someone who will explain it, which is about shadow sphere. So I am introducing shadow sphere as structurally rational. So let's hear some of parents' voices. Aileen says, mothers have no choice but to rely on Korean hagwons, places where they speak Korean language. If you go there, they tell you exactly which courses to take. It's just like the services back in Korea. Jung-suk says, I had so many questions about educational matters, but there's no one in the school to ask these questions. And the hagwons resolved many of them for me, where to send your child for university and which major to choose. Yuna says, my child gets stressed every time he tries to meet the counselor. Whenever he goes to submit something, the door is locked. They, hagwons, manage everything and even making the child submit every single homework assignment through the hagwons. And I was able to see that there are so many Korean hagwons like this, providing the one-stop total service to these parents in Greater Vancouver. So findings show that shadow sphere was culture translation rather than culture preference. Using the shadow sphere was not the culture preference. Korean hagwons in Greater Vancouver provide what schools do not: course selections, grade management, university pathways in Korean language by people who share the meritocratic logic. However, not all parents engage the same way. Across this study, parents took up the shadow sphere with different intensities and toward different ends. From selective breaching, like Jung-suk, this matter was effectively using the hagwon system, which she was very much satisfied with that. And also the surrender of agency. As you see, the Yuna, there was a total surrender of agency. And then she observed that worsening relationship between her son and herself without the significant progress of academic achievement. So she discontinued the service. And so the shadow sphere is not uniform. It is unequally consumed. And I'm also, working on this developing typology. So history in person is reactivated. It is so using shadow sphere is not merely cultural regression. This is more about a structurally coherent response to institutional failure. So, so again, the shadow sphere is not a cultural choice. It is what institutional opacity makes structurally rational. So we saw that official sphere is generating uh, this opacity and gaps, and the shadow spheres fills the gap with money. Then what about communal sphere? What is happening in communal sphere? This is where the story gets more complicated. So the communal sphere is playing as buffer. So these are the pictures from my ethnographic study. So I gathered with with these parents, and then we did lots of different art-based activities. Aileen, one of the parents, says, I wanted to come to the meetings to ask other parents about things I didn't know, like what should I do at certain points. And I wrote in my field note that the art activity creates a sense of togetherness, laughing together. They converse light topics, including daily lives and issues regarding their children and their children's education. Minsu was not the part of our parent group, but he was also part of a different Swiss support group. And he says, for the first time, I probably learned that high school has a credit system and how many credits you need to complete. Things my older child had said in the past, that this is weird. It started to make sense to me. So about Swiss facility parent group that I have been involved with, it was language-based, culturally safe, art-centered monthly gatherings. But I have to note that it was not universal. It is not universal among Swiss programs in nationwide in Canada. Many Swiss programs are actually more unidirectional programs, and then Swiss workers are providing the seminars and lecture-based information. And then these programs view immigrant parents as a passive recipient of information. So this particular Swiss group that I have studied was quite unique. And then it was, I think I included it as an implementation for policymakers because I saw that the value of this group as serving as a community of practice where parents gather together and they engage with collective decoding of official spheres, systems, and rules. And then also through this embodied learning, alt-based learning, they were doing identity restoration and then also building solidarity. In a sense, they were restoring the engaged parent, the image of engaged parents, rebuilding the identity as engaged parents that the official sphere consistently denies. So this type of Swiss facilitated parent group shows that the potential of such group as serving as community of practice, and also it reflects the community cultural wealth by Yoso. And that is a great potential, I believe. Yet, this is half the story. There is a different aspect complicating a celebratory reading of ethnic community. I found that there was the echo chamber effect. Yuna says, it was peer pressure. Everyone else is doing it using hagwons. If I don't, am I the only one leaving my child behind? Minsu says they, Korean parents that he met in the Swiss parent group, they talk all the time about university, hagwons, and tutoring. So this shows that communal sphere was doing two functions at the same time. It was buffering against institutional opacity, but at the same time, it was channeling parents toward shadow education. So it was calibrated to a South Korean logic of investment. The shared repertoire was forged in South Korea's hyper-competitive history, not in the Canadian system parents are entering. The information circulates, including hagwons and tutors and university consultants, within the community, the ethnic community, not from outside. It was recommended through the Korean network, not from Canadian schools. And this is where how private and anxiety becomes collective practice. Communal sphere provides social legitimation for shadow sphere practices, so where individual anxiety becomes collective norm. But should say that this is not a failure of community. This is perhaps the predictable consequence of an official sphere that leaves newcomers informationally isolated. So I'd like to highlight this dynamic through tracing the loop, one participant's trajectory. Aileen came to Canada believing that English language education would offer better life opportunities for her son, who was grade one. In official sphere, she tried to volunteer and attend events and joined PAC as much as possible, but she experienced no greeting, no contact point, no translation service at conference. And then she was wondering, what is course selection? What is this and that? And to her, PAC seemed like a world of their own. So she never returned. Shadow sphere, she turned to Korean hagwons who explained course selection in Korean language by people who shared the meritocratic logic. To It was the system, ironically, that she had migrated to escape. And in communal sphere, she joined a Swiss group seeking emotional restoration and peer guidance, but the same network normalized the hagwon use. So these spheres, Swiss spheres, operated simultaneously, each amplifying the others. So what I want to argue based on these findings is that the loop is not broken easily by individual resilience or community support alone. It is produced by structural conditions, above all by the official sphere's failure to provide a systemic literacy that would allow newcomers to move from periphery to center on their own terms, in Lev and Wenger's term as well. So I'd like to reframe what the field has misread, especially against Asian immigrant parents. There's the image of tiger parents, hyper-competitive parents, but my study reveals that it is perhaps coping strategy, not perhaps, it is coping strategy in response to institutional silence. And hard to reach uninvolved for immigrant parents. These people are structurally locked out by inaccessible artifacts and closed community. And anxious parents, anxiety among the Asian immigrant parents. This is the rational response to information scarcity. So what I argue is that the deficit is institutional, not culture. And this study disrupts culture, essentially it's the readings of East Asian immigrant parenting, which still persist in the field by naming institutional opacity as the actual mechanism. So there are some implications from this study, especially for official sphere, what to do, what should be done. First, it needs to strengthen relational infrastructure, especially it should build some formal bridges between Swiss workers and school counselors, teachers, and currently Swiss is structurally disconnected from the schools it serves, which was clear from my personal involvement as an instructor in teacher education program here at UBC. No teacher candidates, no students were learning about the Swiss or the how to properly engage with immigrant parents or broadly parents. And my wish, I will be involved with teacher education program further, and my wish is to share my research and then perhaps to employ the parent curriculum parent that was suggested by Dr. Pusher in Saskatchewan University. And then it needs to build systemic literacy into communication. Translation alone does not address opacity. Newcomer-facing communication must explain the system's logic, not only deliver its words. It should recognize the labor that fills the gap, which is perhaps interesting research, the topic for my future research. So 8 of 17 parents in this study now work as early childhood educators. They were all professional women with their professional careers, but they were actually working in daycare center in Canada. And additionally, they were taking on the labor of navigating a system the school assumes families already understand. So I argue that this is not only about cultural sensitivity training, but it is also about institutional transparency we have to build. So I am opening the questions and also I'm thinking about the possible directions where to go based on this study. And then I'm seeking your advice from the audiences. There is the gender labor aspect. So what does it mean to study these women that I previously mentioned, not only as parents navigating their children's education, but as adult learners themselves, whose own professional knowledge is under or unrecognized by Canadian institutions. My research field is partly in immigrant integration and also the adult learning and education. So I am trying to think from my the disciplines together. And comparative study, I wonder how does the loop of anxiety operate where the immigrant parent support system is differently structured, for example, in Scotland, England, or Germany? And more broadly, how is integration of immigrant parents differently approached across nations? And within the framework, I am, as I mentioned, I am working on the typology of navigation strategies, especially official and shadow spheres. There's a no uniform and essentialized way of coping among the immigrant parents. So I want to learn what determines which parents resist the loop and which are consumed by it. So my concluding thoughts, what disrupting the loop requires not goodwill, but structural reform of the relational infrastructure. Newcomer families need to move with their full knowledge and dignity from the periphery of Canadian education toward its center. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to questions and our discussion.